It feels almost like a dream when I try to remember that day, the day my world turned upside down. My name is Arthur, and if there's one thing I can say about myself, it's that I've lived a full, busy life. I've built businesses from the ground up, made my fortune, and provided everything I could for my children, Sarah and Ben. I was the proud patriarch of a family that, in my mind, was unshakable. They were my legacy, my purpose, my reason for working so hard all those years. But somewhere along the way, something changed. I didn't see it coming, and I sure as hell didn't expect it to happen the way it did. It all started with my retirement. You'd think that after decades of hard work, I'd look forward to the quiet life, fishing, gardening, maybe spending time with the grandkids. But instead, I felt a void. I didn't know how to fill the space that the corporate grind had once consumed, and neither did my family. When I retired, I imagined I'd be welcomed with open arms by my kids, maybe even a little celebration. But instead, I felt a shift, a subtle, yet unmistakable distance between us. I wasn't entirely sure what went wrong. I mean, I had always worked hard to provide for them. I wasn't a perfect father, but I did the best I could. Ben had followed in my footsteps in business, and Sarah had settled into a life that seemed comfortable enough. We didn't always see eye to eye, but who does? But there was one thing I didn't count on: how busy they'd become after I was out of the picture. I thought that retirement would give me time with them, that we'd finally be able to reconnect. But it wasn't long before I realized they didn't need me in the same way they had before. It wasn't a loud, dramatic confrontation. It was the quiet, cold kind of betrayal that sneaks up on you, slowly and painfully. It started with little things. Ben stopped calling me as much. Sarah became distant. I thought maybe it was because I was still adjusting to retirement, but it wasn't just me. They were pulling away, bit by bit. Then came the phone call. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was sitting in the living room of my house, our house, when the call came. Ben's voice on the other end was calm, too calm. He said, "Dad, we've been talking. It's not that we don't love you, but we think it's time for you to move on. We've got our own lives to lead now. We can't keep worrying about you like this." I sat there, stunned. It was as if the floor had been yanked out from beneath me. Ben said I was too much to deal with, that I was becoming a burden, and that it was time for me to find my own place. The words stung, but more than that, it was the finality in his voice that caught me off guard. This wasn't a discussion, this was a verdict. I wasn't part of their world anymore. That was it. The realization hit me like a cold wave. My children didn't need me anymore. In fact, they probably never had needed me the way I thought they did. The more I tried to call, to reach out, the more they ignored me. My presence was no longer valued, and I was left to wander alone in a world that had once been my own. I wasn't angry at them, not at first. What good would anger do? Instead, I felt a deep sense of loss, something I hadn't expected to feel. After all those years of building my career, my family, and my life around them, they had just moved on. It wasn't personal, not really, but it felt personal. Not long after that, I found myself alone in a small, dilapidated village in Spain. I had always dreamed of living in Europe someday, maybe retiring somewhere quiet, close to nature. My children, in what I thought was an act of kindness, helped arrange everything. They bought me a tiny cottage in a village far from the bustling cities, a place I had never been to before. They thought it would be a good change of scenery. But the truth was, it felt like exile. I didn't know what I expected, but the reality was harsh. The cottage was old, too old. The roof leaked, the windows rattled with every gust of wind, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. The village was quiet, too quiet, and the people barely spoke a word of English. At first, I tried to engage with the few locals who lived there, but they were either too busy with their own lives or too uncomfortable around a stranger who didn't belong. The isolation hit me harder than I could have anticipated. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. I didn't know anyone. I didn't have a role anymore. My identity, which had once been tied to my work, to being a father, to being part of a family, was gone. In those early days, I would wander the narrow cobblestone streets of the village, trying to find something familiar, something that felt like home. But there was nothing. The language barrier made even simple tasks a struggle. The village was small, with no stores, no markets, and only a handful of people who seemed to keep to themselves. I tried to call my children again, but the calls went unanswered. After a while, I gave up. Every morning, I'd wake up in that lonely cottage, the silence pressing in around me. There was no sound of children playing outside, no hustle and bustle of everyday life, just the quiet hum of the wind and the occasional chirp of a bird. I tried to stay busy, cleaning, organizing the house, tending to the small garden, but it never felt like enough. It felt like I was just passing time, waiting for something, anything, to give me a sense of purpose again. I remember one evening, sitting on the porch as the sun set over the hills. The sky turned a deep red, and for a moment, I thought about what had led me here. I had always been the one in control, the one who made the decisions, the one who guided my family. But now here I was, lost in a foreign country with nothing but my thoughts. I felt like I was invisible, like I no longer mattered in the grand scheme of things. My children had moved on without me, and the world felt like a much smaller, lonelier place than I had ever imagined. But in that stillness, something began to change inside of me. I didn't know it then, but this was the beginning of a new chapter. The abandonment, the isolation, the hurt. It would all serve as the foundation for something I never expected. A chance to rebuild. I didn't know how, and I certainly didn't know when, but I could feel something stirring deep within me. I wasn't ready to give up just yet. I had spent too many years living for others to just fade away in the background. There had to be more to life than this. There had to be something worth fighting for. I didn't have a plan, but I did have time. And in that time, I was going to find something that was mine again. This small, quiet village was going to be my crucible, a place where I would confront my past, let go of old expectations, and slowly, piece by piece, build a new life. And maybe, just maybe, I would learn how to live for myself again. It was a few months after I first met Maria that I began to feel like I was settling into this village, into my life here. What started as just a distraction, a simple way to pass the time in the cafe, slowly evolved into something much more meaningful. It wasn't just that I was finding solace in our daily chats or in the warmth of the coffee shop. It was that something inside of me had begun to stir again, a sense of purpose that I thought had long since vanished. It was Maria who suggested I start helping her with her garden. It seemed like an innocent enough task. I had no real experience with gardening or farming, but I had worked with my hands in the past, in the corporate world and at home, and the idea of doing something physical felt like a welcome change. "The earth can teach you more than you know," she had told me one afternoon as we were sitting at the cafe after closing hours. I was skeptical. I had spent most of my life indoors, behind desks, managing spreadsheets and emails, not thinking about the soil beneath my feet. But something in her tone made me think it might be worth a shot. The next morning, I walked over to Maria's small house, which was just a short walk from the cafe. She had a modest garden behind the house, a patch of land where she grew tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. It wasn't much, but it was enough to provide fresh ingredients for the meals she served at the cafe. Maria handed me a spade and a watering can and guided me through the basics: how to prepare the soil, how to plant the seeds, how to care for them as they grew. At first, I was clumsy with the tools, awkward with the motions. My hands were stiff from years of inactivity, and the idea of getting my hands dirty felt strange. But there was something calming about the repetitive motion of digging, planting, and watering. The more I worked, the more I began to feel connected to the earth, as though I was rediscovering a part of myself that had been buried for years. It was hard, physical labor, but it was honest work. As the weeks passed, the garden flourished. The seeds I had planted began to sprout, small green shoots breaking through the soil like little miracles. It was amazing to watch, to witness the simple yet profound process of life unfolding in front of me. One morning, Maria called me over excitedly, pointing at the first ripe tomato hanging from the vine. "Look at that! You did that?" she said, her voice full of pride. I felt a small surge of pride too, though I hadn't expected it. This was my work. I had helped to bring this to life, to nurture something that would eventually feed someone. It wasn't just about the vegetables or the flowers. It was about the act of creating something, of making something real. It was about taking a piece of the earth and giving it care, attention, and patience, and watching it grow in return. Slowly but surely, I began to see that my age didn't have to be a barrier to creating something meaningful. I could still contribute, still be useful in a way that mattered. As the garden expanded, so did my role in the village. The local farmers market was held every Sunday, and Maria encouraged me to help her set up a stall to sell the produce from her garden. At first, I was unsure. I didn't know anything about farming or selling goods at a market, but Maria reassured me that I didn't need to know it all. She'd taught me the basics of gardening, and now I just had to apply that same kind of simplicity to the market. So I agreed. Setting up the stall was harder than I had anticipated. There were so many different things to think about: how to arrange the produce, how to talk to the customers, how to deal with the bartering that was so common in these small markets. I felt out of my element, like a fish trying to breathe out of water. But Maria was there to guide me, to show me the ropes, and slowly I began to gain confidence. People started to recognize me as the American gardener, and they would come over to buy our tomatoes, peppers, and homemade jams. It was on those Sundays, standing at the market with Maria, that I began to feel like I had a real place in this village. For the first time in years, I was contributing to something beyond myself. I wasn't just an old man passing time, I was part of the community. My work had value, and people were appreciating it. In a way, the market became a symbol of my rebirth. It wasn't a glamorous or high-paying venture. It wasn't a corporate deal or an entrepreneurial breakthrough, but it was real work. It was honest, and it was mine. There was something deeply fulfilling about that, about taking something from the earth and turning it into something that could be shared with others. It was in those quiet moments, sitting at the stall and watching people smile as they picked out tomatoes or took home a jar of homemade jam, that I realized I had found my purpose again. The sense of fulfillment didn't come from the money we made, though that helped, but from the work itself. I had rediscovered something that had been lost to me for so long: the joy of creating, of building something from nothing. It wasn't just the act of growing vegetables, it was the act of being useful, of being involved, of making a difference in a small but meaningful way. I learned that purpose doesn't always have to come from grand accomplishments. Sometimes it comes from the small, everyday acts of labor that connect you to the world around you. I had once been a businessman who measured success in profits and deals, but now I was learning to measure success by the soil under my nails and the people I met along the way. The lessons I was learning in the garden and at the market were teaching me that there was always a way to contribute, no matter how old you were, no matter where you came from. I had thought my life was over, that I was just waiting out my time, waiting for the end. But the work, the community, the simple act of being useful, it made me realize that I had so much left to give. And for the first time in years, I felt alive again. As the months passed, I found myself becoming more and more integrated into the village. What had started as a place of isolation, where I felt like a ghost, slowly began to feel like home. The people here, simple, kind-hearted folks, had started to see me not just as the old American man who had no place, but as a neighbor, a fellow human being who had something to contribute. And in turn, I began to see them not just as strangers, but as people who had lived their whole lives with their own struggles, joys, and experiences. I remember the first time I truly felt like I belonged. It was a Saturday evening, and the village was holding a small celebration in honor of the harvest. I wasn't sure what to expect, but Maria insisted I attend, assuring me that it was the perfect opportunity to meet more of the locals. I'll admit, I was hesitant at first. It wasn't that I didn't want to meet people, but I wasn't sure how to navigate a community so tight-knit. I had spent most of my life in the corporate world, where relationships were transactional and impersonal, where I had hired and fired employees with little thought for their lives outside of the office. Now, I was in a small village where everyone knew everyone, and I didn't want to make a fool of myself or seem out of place. But when I walked into the village hall that evening, I was greeted with a warmth I wasn't expecting. People turned and smiled, nodding in acknowledgement, and before long, I found myself in the midst of a lively conversation with a group of villagers. There was Paco, a retired farmer who spent his days tending to his small flock of sheep, and Marta, a teacher at the local school, whose eyes sparkled as she talked about her passion for education. There was also Diego, the blacksmith, who had lived in the village for decades and was known for his craftsmanship and quiet wisdom. We all sat around a long table, piled high with bread, olives, cheeses, and cured meats. The food was simple, but it tasted like it had been made with care. People laughed, shared stories, and passed around plates of food. I had never felt so at ease. I realized then that these were not just people I could talk to. They were people I could learn from, people who would teach me more about life than I had ever learned in the boardrooms of my past. As the evening wore on, I found myself drawn into deeper conversations. It wasn't just idle small talk. It was real dialogue about the past, about life, about the future. I listened to Paco's stories of working the land in his youth, of the hardships and triumphs of farming, and I marveled at the way he spoke about his work with such pride. Marta spoke passionately about the children she taught, her love for her students, and the challenges of educating in a small village where resources were scarce. Diego, with his weathered hands, talked about the art of blacksmithing, of shaping metal with fire, and of the satisfaction he found in creating something that could last a lifetime. I shared some of my own stories, not of business deals or city life, but of the lessons I had learned from years of working with people. I wasn't sure how much they cared about corporate strategies or profit margins, but I told them about the importance of building relationships, of finding common ground, and of taking pride in your work, no matter how small it might seem. To my surprise, they listened with genuine interest. They didn't see me as just some old man who had been abandoned by his family, but as someone who had lived a different kind of life. Someone who could offer a perspective they might not have considered, and as I listened to their stories, I realized that they had just as much to teach me. They had lived through different challenges, but their resilience, their sense of community, and their understanding of what it meant to work together were lessons I needed to learn. From that night forward, I became a regular at these community gatherings. I was invited to family meals, local events, and even to small celebrations. Every time I walked into a room, I was greeted with a smile, a handshake, or a friendly wave. These weren't just acquaintances. They were friends, and they were starting to become my new family. I also noticed that the more I became involved in the village, the more I started to feel a sense of responsibility for these people. They had opened their hearts to me, and I wanted to do the same. I began to help Paco with his sheep, learning the delicate art of animal husbandry. I spent afternoons in Marta's classroom, assisting with activities and listening to the children as they practiced their lessons. Diego took me under his wing as well, teaching me the basics of blacksmithing. Each new skill, each new experience was a way for me to repay the kindness the villagers had shown me. It wasn't just about the work, it was about the bonds I was forming. With each passing day, I found that I was no longer the outsider, the old man left behind. I was part of something bigger, something that felt more real than anything I had experienced in my past life. The friendships I was building with these people were genuine, unpretentious, and based on mutual respect. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when I felt the pangs of loneliness, when I missed my family and the life I had left behind. But even in those moments, I found that the village was there for me. The people here understood the value of human connection. They understood that life wasn't about what you had, but about who you were and how you treated others. By the time the next harvest season came around, I had built a network of friends who felt more like family. I wasn't alone anymore, and that realization brought me more peace than I ever thought possible. These were people who cared about me, who saw me for who I was, not for the age or the burdens I had carried with me for so long. And as I sat at another community table, sharing stories and food with the people who had become my new family, I realized that this village had given me something I had thought was lost forever, a sense of belonging. It wasn't just that I had found friends, it was that I had found a place where I could be myself, without judgment, without the weight of the past, and where I could truly start living again. When Maria first brought up the idea of opening a business together, I wasn't sure what to think. I'd spent years running large companies back in the States, making deals, closing contracts, and calculating profits. But I quickly realized this place wasn't about that. This was about something deeper. The village had so much to offer, but it had never had a way to share it with the world. There were the most amazing vegetables, the freshest olive oil, and handmade crafts that would have been perfect for any shop, but no one had put them all in one place. That's when Maria and I began to seriously talk about opening a small shop to showcase the community's talents. I won't lie, I had my doubts. I hadn't exactly been a small-town businessman before. The thought of starting from scratch was intimidating, especially after everything that had happened with my family. But Maria was persistent. "Arthur, it's not about the numbers or making a fortune. This village needs something like this, a place where people can feel proud of their hard work and showcase what they've built," she told me. Her belief in the project helped me shift my perspective. It wasn't about being successful by old standards. It was about building something meaningful. We started small. La Tienda de la Tierra, as we named it, would be a modest shop, but we intended for it to reflect everything this village stood for: authenticity, tradition, and hard work. I began going door to door, talking to the villagers and collecting whatever they were willing to sell: tomatoes, handmade blankets, wooden bowls, even jars of honey. In return, I helped them understand the potential of this place and how it could be a shared asset for the whole community. Soon, we had a small collection of goods from just about everyone. Maria worked her magic with the presentation. She arranged the goods beautifully, making sure everything looked as inviting as it was genuine. I handled the logistics, getting the word out, organizing the pricing, and managing the little things that helped keep the shop running smoothly. Every time someone walked through the door, I felt a new sense of purpose. The shop wasn't just a business. It was the heart of the village. People came not only to buy, but to connect, chat, and share stories. The grand opening was a simple affair: just a few villagers, some food, and a lot of laughter. I didn't expect much, but it turned out to be the most gratifying experience of my life. To see people from all corners of the village come together, showing pride in what they had created, was humbling. I stood there, next to Maria, as the ribbon was cut and the first few customers walked in, and for the first time in years, I felt truly useful. I wasn't just someone who'd been left behind, I was contributing again, in a way that mattered to me and to everyone here. The business started to take off slowly but surely. The villagers came in not just for the produce, but to see their friends and neighbors. Each item in the shop had a story behind it, stories about hard work, tradition, and community. People came in to buy, but they stayed to chat. They'd tell stories of their childhood, of how their families had been part of the land for generations, of how the world had changed. It wasn't just a transaction, it was an exchange of memories, experiences, and pride. I'll admit, I was proud of what we'd built. The shop wasn't anything fancy, but it had become a vital part of the community. And it wasn't just about the financials. It was about reconnecting with something pure, something real. The way people would come in, browse the shelves, and exchange their goods and ideas, it felt like we were building more than just a business. We were rebuilding the village's sense of connection. Every day I'd wake up, look at the shop, and feel a deep sense of gratitude. My life had come full circle. I no longer felt like a useless burden. In fact, I felt more useful now than I had in years. I had found a place where I could contribute, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. And it wasn't about the money. It was about something far more rewarding: building relationships, restoring pride, and creating a legacy in a place that truly needed it. This shop was the beginning of a new chapter in my life, and I knew, deep down, that it was the best decision I had ever made. One day, I received a letter from my granddaughter, Emma. She apologized for how they had treated me, admitting that they had been wrong to call me a burden. She shared that after speaking with some villagers, they now understood how much I had grown and what I had built in Spain. I felt a mix of emotions, but the truth was I had already found peace within myself. I had created a new life, one that was fulfilling and full of purpose. Their apology was a kindness, but I no longer needed their approval. The next morning, I walked through the village square, holding the letter. I realized that my dignity was no longer tied to their opinion. I had reclaimed my life, and in doing so, I found a sense of self-worth that I hadn't known in years. The apology was appreciated, but my journey here had been far more valuable.